Hello, friends. This past week, I was listening to an episode of the New York Times Book Review podcast, and they were talking about the books that they read in school. And it was a great podcast. I recommend it. But some of the context behind that podcast was a study that they cited comparing the books that were most frequently taught in 2025 against the books that were most frequently taught in 1989. And this study found that 6 of the 10 most commonly taught books were the same in both years. So I'm going to read that list of the most commonly taught books from 2025, and I'll put the 6 books that were the same in bold on the screen. So the 2025 list contains Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Crucible by Arthur Miller, Macbeth by Shakespeare, Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, Night by Elie Wiesel, Hamlet by Shakespeare, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, and Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. You might notice that all of these texts were written by white authors, and all of them were published more than 60 years ago. And in case you, like me, were curious about the 1989 list, that one included The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Julius Caesar, The Scarlet Letter, and Lord of the Flies. There's a different video I could create here about canonization and teaching of literature and stability and change of the literary canon and book challenges and parent scrutiny and all these things that affect teachers' ability to introduce new books to the classroom. I think that is a discussion that is probably more intelligently held by other people in other venues. And while I do think there is a problem with diversity in the literary canon and the canon of books that are taught in schools, I also want to point out that what these lists might indicate is that there is more consensus on traditional texts than alternative texts, although I presume that we're really not at the place where diversity should be in teaching. But what I want to talk about, what these lists made me think about, were the books that I read in school, what value I got out of those books, and where I saw my teachers go off the beaten path and in what ways. I can say right away that I read 5 of the books on the most commonly taught books list as part of my middle school or high school curricula. I think I read To Kill a Mockingbird as a middle school book, and I read several of the others on my own. But I have a confession. I still have not read The Great Gatsby, nor have I seen the movie. And yet, I kind of feel like I know everything I need to know about that book through cultural osmosis. I don't necessarily feel a very strong draw to read it, except like that urge to actually be in the know. I also have never read The Crucible, although we did read The Death of a Salesman in high school. So I created a list of books that I remember reading in school in chronological order through the years, and I'm just going to gab about what I remember and what I don't remember. And I'd love to hear about what you read in school as well, and what you remember and what you don't remember. For context, I graduated high school in 2011, although based on that study, it kind of seems like the year is almost irrelevant. And then additionally, I went to a public school in upstate New York. So when I think about what I read in school, the first year that I remember, like full books being read as a class, was in 5th grade. I remember reading The Giver and Watership Down that year. I don't remember either of those books especially well, although I remember enjoying The Giver a lot. And its premise sticks with me to this day. I've said this before, I like books about time and memory hijinks, and this has to be one of the first books that I read that dealt with memory explicitly and the concept of utopia and what that means. Watership Down, I remember less, except I remember only the advanced readers in the class were assigned to read this one. I also don't remember loving it, but I thought it was fine. This was about a group of rabbits who flee from the destruction of their home, from the destruction of their old warren, and they go to establish a new society somewhere else. I also remember that this has a little bit of conlang in it. The language that the rabbits speak to each other is a language called Lapine. And I think the way language was used to establish culture in this book was probably pretty formative for me. I may have also read The Hobbit around this age as well, which also introduces fictional languages for the sake of world building and sort of establishing a culture. Moving on to the 6th grade, the only book that stands out in my memory is The Phantom Tollbooth. And this one stands out because I would consider it one of my favorite young person's books of all time. I was enamored with the wordplay in this book. I would put it in a category with Alice in Wonderland. I would put those in the same bucket. They're both very clever, they're whimsical portal fantasies, and they both have a lot of wordplay and philosophy. But Tollbooth, I feel, is a little more on the didactic side. It's more directly talking about education and the value of knowledge, but I thought it was easier to read and get at a younger age. In middle school, which was 7th and 8th grade for me, the only books I really remember are The Outsiders and To Kill a Mockingbird. The Outsiders I remember being thoroughly unimpressed by. It's a book about sensitive teenage boys in 1960s Oklahoma who were born on the wrong side of the tracks. Middle school me thought that book was really corny. I didn't really connect with the characters. I don't really remember liking it. On the other hand, I rated To Kill a Mockingbird 5 stars on Goodreads at whatever age I registered for Goodreads, which was like much closer to middle school than I am now. But I can hardly remember what this book is about. It's about a girl whose father defends a black man who is falsely accused of a crime, but I don't really remember any details about how that story is told, and I have no idea if I would rate it the same way if I read it today. So if you are watching and you've read To Kill a Mockingbird more recently than I have, I would love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments. When I move forward into high school, again, my memory of what I read in my freshman and sophomore years, I think what we read must have been entirely unremarkable. And the only books that I can remember are books that were on that most frequently taught books list. So in those 2 years, my freshman and sophomore years, I remember reading Romeo and Juliet, Night, and Of Mice and Men. I think Shakespeare must be so tough to teach to high schoolers. I remember reading from our textbook, which had line by line annotations. And what I've found as I've gotten older is that I really don't like reading an annotated edition of Shakespeare because my temptation is always to read the notes after every line, which results in a horribly fragmented reading experience. But also, a 14-year-old just has so much historical background and linguistic difference to sift through to get to the themes of the text. So an annotated edition makes sense, but I can't remember now if the 3 stars I gave Romeo and Juliet on my Goodreads would be attributed to a bad classroom experience or if it's just not a very interesting story, because I don't think I've touched this Shakespeare play since I read it when I was 14 years old. But I did end up taking a full-on Shakespeare course in college, so I must not have been too turned off by the Shakespeare instruction I got in school. But we also didn't read Romeo and Juliet in that course because I think the assumption that was that you probably read Romeo and Juliet in high school. And then Night, I think, was a really powerful testimony of the Holocaust. I'm glad to have read it in school, and I'm glad to see it in the top 10 list. Of Mice and Men, I rated 5 stars on Goodreads, so I guess I liked it. I remember the ending, but not the details of how it gets there. I guess my takeaway from doing this reflection on what I read in school is that I don't remember any of it very well. I remember the emotional weight or the emotional valence of certain books, and maybe that's what reading in school gives you when it's at its best, is early encounters with empathy and emotional truth, and maybe that's fine. That's good. Entering my junior and senior years of high school, the number of books I remember reading spikes way up. My high school day consisted of 4 80-minute classes a day, and most classes would only take place in one of the 2 semesters. So the exception was some of the AP classes that I took, which would run for the entire school year because they were more intense and they wanted to teach it all the way up until the exam in April. So my junior year, I took AP US History, but the class meetings for AP US History, they ran all year, but they alternated between US history and US literature. And those courses were taught in tandem so that we were reading texts from the chronological period that we were studying for the most part. And I thought that was a very effective way to study both subjects. I'm sure we're not the only school that ever took this approach. And the texts I remember reading in that American literature class are Winesburg, Ohio, The Age of Innocence, The Grapes of Wrath, and Death of a Salesman. But I'm confused by my memory here because these were all written in the first half of the 20th century, and I can't remember anything that we read from the 19th century. I know we read some nonfiction texts and poetry and persuasive writing from the 18th century, but from the 19th century, I'm drawing a blank. We must have read excerpts or essays from Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. That's what's coming to mind. Maybe some writing from Frederick Douglass as well, but we didn't read The Scarlet Letter. We didn't read Mark Twain. I can't think of a single novel that we read that was written earlier than the 20th century. But when I turn to the books that I do remember reading, the authors are still very white. Winesburg, Ohio seems like the odd one out here, and that was actually our summer reading assignment. We didn't do much in-class discussion of this one, but I think it's also the book that I might be the most interested to reread from this set. Winesburg, Ohio is a linked collection of short stories about a small town in Ohio. It's an early example of modernist literature, and I remember it being about loneliness and like the quiet melancholy of everyday life. The Age of Innocence is set in the 19th century, isn't it? Even though it was published in the 1920s. That one, yeah, so maybe we read that one as like our early 19th century, but it's set in New York City of the 1870s or 1880s. And it's about social conventions and propriety and duty. I don't remember much about the plot. There's a love triangle of some kind. There's the woman the protagonist ought to marry and the woman he wants to marry. Yeah, I would reread this one too. Fun fact, Edith Wharton was the first woman to win a Pulitzer Prize with this book. And I can't say that I remember the other 2 texts very well. I'll just say that if my US Lit teacher had an agenda, if he had a particular taste that he was pushing here, it was books about the failure of the American dream, about the constraints of social expectations, and about loneliness or the inability to connect with other people emotionally or socially. And those themes, I think, carry forward into the books I read in the following year with the same teacher. So my senior year was the AP English year, and the teacher was the same guy, and he was a big theater guy. So I actually mostly remember reading plays in that class. I remember reading Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf by Edward Albee, Hedda Gabler by Henrik Ibsen, M. Butterfly by David Henry Hwang. And our summer reading assignment that year was Howard's End by E.M. Forster. I remember being bored to death reading Howard's End over the summer. It is probably a very lovely book, but as a summer reading assignment, this was really hard. It was very English. It's somehow about class dynamics in early 20th century England. Class dynamics that I had no context for. And I think for most books you read in school, good teachers will give you a hook, a reason why this book is interesting to read, why its themes are special, or why they connect to other things you're learning in school. But for our summer reading assignments, we didn't really get that. I just remember being told to read this book and to produce an essay in response to one of several prompts. I think Functionally, the summer reading assignment was probably used as a diagnostic tool. It was a way for our teacher to assess our critical reading and writing skills at the start of the year. But I think the way the assignment was executed made it much more of a chore than it could have been, because I just did not get this book. In general, though, I think this teacher was a very good English teacher, but I wasn't extremely interested in a lot of the themes that he was interested in. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf stands out because this was a domestic drama about toxic marital discord. I just don't know that high schoolers are the best audience for that play. I'd be more curious to revisit that play now, ideally by watching it rather than reading it. I do remember watching the movie for that one. And Butterfly, I did find interesting. It's inspired by a true story of a French diplomat's affair with a Chinese opera singer, only to discover that this lover was a man and a spy, and so this was all a honeypot trap. So this play does some unpacking of racial and gender stereotypes and fantasies, and I thought that was interesting and a little different from the other books that we were reading, or the other texts rather. This is a play. It's not really, I don't know, it's not. The last set of texts I want to mention, I also read in my senior year of high school as part of a creative writing class, and this was with a different teacher. So in this class, we read Spoon River Anthology, The House on Mango Street, and The Poisonwood Bible. And this set of books was probably actually the books I liked and connected with the most. Spoon River Anthology was very similar to Winesburg, Ohio, but it actually predates Winesburg, Ohio by several years. This book is poetry, but it explores the residents of a small town through a collection of epitaphs. The House on Mango Street is told through a series of vignettes. It's about a young Latina girl growing up in Chicago, and I loved the structure of both of those books and their lyricism. They were beautifully written. The Poisonwood Bible was the most modern book I think I was ever assigned in school in terms of when it was written, and it inspired me to read more Barbara Kingsolver on my own time, and I still consider Barbara Kingsolver to be one of my favorite authors of all time. So those are the books that I remember reading in high school. Only a few of those books stand out to me as books that I genuinely loved at the time, but I do think they shaped my sensibilities and my understanding of the different possibilities and meanings a text could take on. There was unfortunately not much diversity in the authors we were reading. These books were overwhelmingly written by white authors. It would have been nice to read from more perspectives and to read more contemporary fiction, but I am kind of, in hindsight, impressed by the diversity and the formal structure of the text we were reading. We were reading a lot of texts that were not novels, in addition to the one-off poems that I didn't really get into here. I read that poetry collection in Spoon River Anthology. I read interconnected short stories in Winesburg, Ohio. We have this vignettes from The House on Mango Street. I never read or watched more plays than I did in that senior English class, and I don't know, I'm somewhat inspired to go back and do more rereads of some of these books now that I'm 20 years older. If you're still watching, I'd love to hear what books you remember reading and what have stuck with you. If there's any books I mentioned that you can refresh my memory on and let me know if it's worth rereading or not, that would also be very appreciated. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.